Introduce to you Simon Perry. Serves as the chaplain to Robinson College, University of Cambridge. He is a past member of the ministry team at Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church in London. He is the author of several books, including Atheism After Christendom, Disbelief in the Age of Encounter, Jesus for Humanists, Resurrecting Interpretation, Technology, Hermeneutics, and the Parable of the Rich Man and Lazarus, and All Who Came Before. Simon has his PhD from Cambridge University and studies in religious and congregational ministries. We want to just welcome Simon to our webinar today. We look forward to his presentation and his engaging personality as he shares with us Atheism After Christendom. Simon, please join us.
Thank you, Stan, for such a great welcome there. Greetings to you all from what has to be said a miserable evening here in Cambridge in the UK. I would like to tell you a little bit more about the book Atheism After Christendom, in that we were hoping it would be published already. Sadly, it is not, and due to a problem with the printers, we're not quite sure when it will be out. But hopefully during the course of this evening, we'll walk you through some of the contents. As we do that, there'll be a pause every few minutes or so, where hopefully you would ask me some questions and I might, I will have asked you a question. So the first question I'd like to ask, Enton, if you're happy to bring it up, can you describe in one sentence what God or what a God is without using the word supernatural? I will explain why at a later stage. To begin with then, I suppose it's true to say that there are as many atheisms as there are Christianities. So it's a very difficult thing to speak about atheism as a whole. And modern atheism is a very different thing to some of the pre-modern and ancient atheisms that went before it. The sad reality is that most modern atheists, particularly most militant modern atheists, don't know very much about what a God is, tend to be theologically quite illiterate, don't know what belief is, don't know what worship is. And this is highlighted increasingly, I think, by several contemporary authors who I will work through during the course of this evening. The most significant of which, I think, writing in the UK at the moment, is somebody called Gavin Hyman, who argues that modern atheism is not atheist enough. And hopefully we'll have a little bit more to say about that as time goes on. But most histories of atheism begin with some form of ancient Greek non-belief. Now, one of the things that Gavin Hyman points out is that non-belief in ancient Greece is something very, very different to non-belief today. The two things are just not comparable at all. It's often supposed that the original atheist is somebody called Thales of Miletus, but I question that. I'd like to start somewhere entirely different, or in fact not that different, actually. I'd like to start in Athens with a figure that you no doubt have heard of, Socrates. Socrates was executed for being impious, and he was charged with atheism. So what does it mean that Socrates was an atheist, particularly when he did believe in God? If you read his writings, he was a believer in some form of God. The main reason that he was in trouble in Athens is that he did not worship the gods of the state. And in particular, he was corrupting the young men of Athens. And by young men, we should probably picture guys aged from around 15 to 18 years of age. And it's worth remembering, in this fledgling democracy, the early state of Athens, about 400 years before Christ, the city had faced a pretty difficult time at the hands of invaders and so on. It was suffering from the ravages of war and humiliation, and the future of its welfare depended on the young men of Athens being subservient to the gods of the state. And Socrates was upsetting all of that. Now, worth remembering as well that life expectancy at the time was around about 26 years old, 26 years of age. And in this democracy, the only people who were allowed to vote, well, there weren't many of them. If you're a woman, you didn't have a vote. If you're a slave, you didn't have a vote. If you're a peasant, you didn't have a vote. So when you take all these things into consideration, the young men of Athens were the very people on whom the future of Athenian welfare depended. And Socrates was put to death because he was intoxicating these young men with his endless radical chit-chat, getting them to think for themselves, getting them to question the legitimacy of the gods of the state, gods that expect people to behave in particular ways that benefit the city, or at least defend the privileges of those who are in charge of the city. The same could be said of ancient Rome, I suppose. The atheism in ancient Rome, again, it referred to those who did not worship the gods of the state. So as far as Rome were concerned, the Jewish people groups were atheist. They were atheist because they did not worship Rome's gods. And likewise, Christians were often accused in the early imperial period of being atheists themselves. They would not worship the gods that the world of politics wanted them to worship. That's what made them atheist. Now, of course, as time goes on, we see that Constantine comes to power, the Emperor Constantine. Now, the empire, Roman Empire, had by the 4th century split into 4 regions, 2 in the east and 2 in the west. So it was a fairly difficult thing to manage, a huge sprawling empire. And what Constantine set about doing was to unify the title. So he first conquered the west, then conquered the east, and in his first battle outside the gates of Rome, he was in a position where strategically he was outnumbered. He was tactically disadvantaged by his location, and still he managed to win this stunning victory, and he attributed this victory to the God of the Christians. And so the story goes. Now, as I'm sure you've heard of previous lectures on this similar topic, that there's a radical shift to which Christianity was subjected when Constantine comes to power. Before, it had been a marginalized, frequently persecuted religion. With Constantine's endorsement, the persecution ceased and the church began to find itself in a position of increasing power. That is the beginning of Christendom. We know as the story unfolds, Jesus is no longer presented as a peasant builder from some nowhere town in a nowhere region called Lower Galilee. Jesus himself is presented in artwork, for instance, as something more akin to an emperor. The disciples are no longer portrayed as peasant fishermen. They are dressed up in the garb of senators. And so the church found itself increasingly in a position of power. Throughout this era, however, there are underground movements, and Stuart Murray Williams has outlined some of these movements in his books on After Christendom. There are the Donatists, the Waldensians, the Anabaptists, and so on. There are always people that questioned whether the church had to be in a position of power before it could do God's will on earth. And as I progressed through the book, one of the ways that I would define Christendom principally is that it is the belief that in order to do God's will on earth, you first need to capture power. And of course, I think as any ethicist will tell you, the process of capturing power changes your conception of what a God is and what good is. But I'm not going to go into great detail about condemning the whole era of Christendom. There's been plenty of that, and you run thin ice playing that game anyway, I think. There are often sort of modern atheistic debates which focus on questions like, is the Catholic Church a force for good in the world? The problem with that is that Christendom has shaped us in ways that it's very difficult to measure. So the very criteria by which we measure whether Christendom was good or bad are themselves derived from Christendom. Our notion of good and evil, our notion of what it means to be human, these things are so deeply and subconsciously shaped at a cultural level that we're just not in a position to climb out of history and affirm or condemn whether medieval Christendom was a good thing. Regardless of what happened in medieval Christendom, it came to an end. You probably know the story, the Reformations that tore their way across Western Europe. Martin Luther is often presented as the first figure of modernity when his appeal to authority is no longer through the authorized channels of the Christendom Church. Instead, he goes straight to the Bible, and the sola scriptura principle, he stands on the Bible alone. There's an argument that says that this move puts a lot of power into the hands of an individual. It's the first move towards modern individualism. Whether that's convincing is open to question. But in effect, what he had essentially done was to take Christendom out of the hands of those in power and simply relocate it to the regional princes on whom he was dependent. Whether religious freedom was born in this era, we don't know. Again, I'm not a historian, so I can't speak with any confidence about that. But whatever happened, we're talking about the breakup of Christendom. And it's really in the 16th century that everything starts to go wrong. Christendom breaks down into multiple regions, multiple Christendoms, which often are warring with one another. And you may have heard of the religious wars of the 17th century. And it was a veteran of one of those wars that really lies at the beginning of modernity as a whole, the modern era. His name was René Descartes. He's famous for coming out with these words, "I think, therefore I am." Now, what Descartes did is say, okay, let's all stop fighting with each other. Forget about the authority of a distant god over there in Rome. Let's rethink about who this God is. Doubt everything, question everything. And Descartes famously questioned everything so thoroughly that in the end, he said you should doubt everything outside of yourself, everything about yourself. The only thing that you cannot doubt in the end is the fact that you are thinking. Your whole life could be a dream foisted upon you by some malicious demon. Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am. The only thing of which I can be certain is that I am in the process of thinking." So he then rebuilt a view of God and argued for the existence of God. He was still a Christian, but now this is a God viewed on my own terms. It's the God of my own imagination that I have constructed. Whereas once it had been the human beings who had existed at the caprice of the Creator, now it's God who exists at the caprice of human beings. God only exists as long as we keep believing in him. It's a bit like Tinkerbell. And so the question of the death of God was only a matter of time. A little later on, we come to Isaac Newton, and Newton made these great breakthroughs in optics and in the world of physics. He was actually a theologian and an alchemist, but he's famous, of course, for discovering gravity. The famous story of the apple falling from the tree and so on. But what Newton uncovered was not just the existence of a universe where apples fall from trees, but where the heavenly bodies follow exactly the same scientific rules as the pebble in our hand. The stars in the most distant galaxies behave in the same way that a rock sitting in my hand behaves. The same laws of gravity govern both. So this didn't just pull apples down from trees. This pulled bishops down from their seats, and it pulled kings down from their thrones. And ultimately, in the popular mind, it would pull God himself down from heaven. He's now just one of us. He's now there as a figment of our imagination. Now, Newton and Descartes both retained their Christian faith. And it was a third figure, Denis Diderot, who first came along and argued that he took Newton and Descartes more seriously than they took themselves. He ruthlessly pursued their insights to say that we should no longer respect at all the idea of this God up there in heaven. He's regarded by many as the first modern atheist. Like most modern atheisms, what he's rejecting is not so much Christianity as such, but he is angry about the abuses of Christendom. And when you read his arguments, 99% of it is leveled at the abuses of Christendom, not Christian belief as a whole. He was quite an elusive and intelligent writer. It's difficult to get a hold on what Diderot really thought. But one of the things he did say is that he longed for the day when monarchies would end, when the last king would be hung on the entrails of the last priest. He wanted Christendom to come to a close. But there's a question over whether he stated this explicitly in his day. He was in all kinds of trouble with the religious authorities, whereas it was one of his friends, the fourth figure I wanted to look at, the Baron de Holbach, who was in 18th century Paris in his salons, which were like an invitation-only wine bar for upper classes, where he would meet with other atheists. And it's the Baron de Holbach who wrote the first serious treatise on modern atheism. It's called The System of Nature. It's beautifully written. It's probably the best piece of literature of modern atheism, right up until the 20th century sees Bertrand Russell. And in his System of Nature, the Baron de Holbach is arguing, again, against Christendom more than he's arguing against Christianity. It's the work of a fanatic, one commentator has said, and he writes with all the intelligence and all the literary sophistication of an 18th century Richard Dawkins. It's a great read, but a lot of it is simply unsupported eloquence. He, as far as I'm concerned, is the last real atheist heavyweight until, as I said, Bertrand Russell is writing right up until the 1960s. And again, when you read Bertrand Russell's writing on religion, and you read through the whole of his history of Western philosophy, the thing that riles him about religion, once again, it's not Christianity as such. Again, 99% of what Bertrand Russell is complaining about is Christendom, not Christianity. They're very different things. And Russell, like his predecessors, were writing at a time when it was dangerous to be atheist, where being atheist would get you into trouble. We could go into a lot more detail about this, but it's only really in the last generation when atheism has become properly safe, when atheism has become an almost respectable set of convictions to hold. And so many of you will now have heard the new atheists. Who's in that crowd? Daniel Dennett, I think, is probably the only intellectual amongst them. Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins is probably the most famous. There is something new about these atheists, though. These new atheists, what's new about them is that throughout history, atheism has got you into trouble. Atheism has been a rebellion against the gods of the state when those gods are proving to be dehumanizing. Whereas under the new atheism, it's almost an endorsement of the gods of one's own age, an endorsement of the dehumanizing gods that are railroading our world into a state of self-destruct. So what they tend to do, now that the God of Christendom is basically been shuffled off into the retirement home, where he's only visited by kind-hearted or curious souls, he's left as a spineless, toothless, spent force, like a former dictator who can't do any harm anymore. And now the new atheists are being rebellious and fighting this God of Christendom who's already got one foot in the grave. My argument is that there are other gods who are causing serious damage in our world, and the new atheists do not recognize them. They're too busy rebelling against the God that Friedrich Nietzsche has already pronounced as dead over 100 years ago. Under the new atheism, atheism itself has become pitifully domesticated. It's lost its teeth, and my argument is that we can set about reviving it. Now, at that stage, I think I should pause for breath and invite Stan to see if you guys have any questions or any responses to my question.
Enton, the question is posted, and we'll have that up. The question that we're asking people to respond to is, can you describe in one sentence what God is without using the word supernatural? And we'll give you some time to ponder that and to share your comments, your thoughts in the chat box. Simon, as you were presenting, I was thinking about, the whole thing about Christendom and how that interacts with our understanding of Christianity and atheism. And there's so many times when I've heard arguments against, or for, or in a sense, arguments for or against atheism, why they have no belief. And it's rarely put in that term of power and that Christendom model. What does that mean for the person who is, the average person in the pew that really doesn't understand this connection to where these, in a sense, these different points of view are taking place is at a much different level than what they perhaps have been trained or been educated in through their church?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question, I suppose. Can I just clarify what I think the question is before I ramble off in the wrong direction? Looking at this through the context of power, rather than seeing atheism as a set of theories about who God is. Now, I think there are political reasons for that, which we can get into further if necessary. But one of the products of the post-Enlightenment era, I believe, is that we can understand the world simply in a cerebral fashion, just using our brains, just using our minds, that things like belief and worship and gods are religious words for religious people, and that's got nothing to do with politics. Christendom, I think, is the sort of welding together of church and state, which explicitly links Christianity and politics, or religion and politics. We've inherited a worldview where religion and politics are seen as two very different things. My argument is, for the time being, I think I'll avoid using the word religion because it's fraught with difficulty. If I talk about worship, I would argue that worship is the stuff to which we attach worth. Now, of course, that doesn't get us very far, but the things that we value, the things that we build our lives around, that's worship. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religious thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be God. Even if you're a Christian, it's very often unacknowledged that we're actually building our lives around other stuff, and God is kind of the icing on the cake or a ticket into heaven or something like that. My argument is that worship will always manifest itself politically. Politics is the way in which we shape our lives around the things that we value. Politics is always, therefore, based upon worship. So whenever I listen to a political leader, we're about to have an election in the UK in the morning, I'm listening theologically to hear what it is that they're worshipping. What are the values that their systems are being built around? Yeah. And by politics, I don't just mean political parties and political figures and political leaders. politics is simply the way that we organize our lives. So every church community has a political way of being together. And it was that political way of being together that meant the church were persecuted in the early years, because their way of being together posed a threat to the empire. It said, being human means that we're going to revolve our lives around the God revealed in Jesus Christ. It means we can't say that Caesar is Lord if we say that Jesus is Lord. They were under no illusion that Christianity was a politically subversive set of convictions. And the Romans were under no illusion either, which is why they were severely persecuted. The split between religion and politics, or between Christianity and politics, is an artificial one that many of us have been too happy to tolerate for too long.
Yeah. Some people are beginning to type responses to the question. Alan shares God is creator and sustainer of the world. And we have a couple more people typing. Here's one. I'm going to share a definition of God. A guy who talked to some Jewish guys, some Christian guys, some Islam guys, and accidentally caused more people to die than anyone else in human history. That is from the Urban Dictionary.
That's great. That's great. Of course, it endorses a popular myth.
It does.
That you will not find a serious historian here in Cambridge that believes that wars are started by religion. I don't know whether I need to defend that or not, but it's of course it's claimed frequently by modern militant atheists, but there is no evidence for it, and no serious historian would look at the world that way. I think people were still making this claim as recently as 30 or 40 years ago, but not anymore.
Well, and
not anymore. When you look at...
Yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. It is, though, according to several polls, at least of people in North America, that the God who causes all these wars is one of the first reactions that people who do not have a faith affiliation is the first thing that they say in terms of rejecting people of faith when they're being spoken to or asked about what is their belief system, that kind of thing.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? It being a myth, again, it just betrays something about people that don't think they believe anything at all are perfectly happy to subscribe to myths not based on evidence. Again, when you look at the evidence, it falls apart. Religion as a whole, if we go back in time, the Egyptians had no word for religion. The Greeks had no word for religion. The Hebrew people had no word for religion. The Romans did, but it meant something very, very different from what it means today. Religion was a binding obligation. And there's a book by William T. Cavanaugh called The Myth of Religious Violence. It comprehensively bombs this idea out of the water. It's a fantastic book, which I commend to you. And William Cavanaugh, he has some great questions in his public lectures. He says, would you be willing to kill another person for Jesus? And then he says, would you be willing to kill another person for your country? Now, regardless of your answer to either question, it's only the latter question that you can ask with a straight face. And I say that as a former member of the military. Kavanaugh's idea is that religion, as we understand it today, was created to justify the violence of our nation state, to separate a rational, peace-loving us from a violent, bloodthirsty, irrational them. And you only have to read Sam Harris's book to see that mythology played out.
Yeah. I noticed Carol Bowman has made a statement. She said, in terms of your question, describing God without the use of the word supernatural. God is an energy or force of love, creating and working in the universe in love. So we still have some people typing. So I think we'll be getting some responses further on in the presentation. But Simon, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go off stage and allow you to continue on. If you want to respond to either Alan or Carol's definition, please do so, and then I invite you to continue with your presentation.
Thank you. These are both great definitions, I think, of who God is. Alan says God is creator and sustainer of the universe, of the world. Carol, God is an energy or force of love, creating and working in the universe in love. Bill, God is a human conception of supranatural being and power, being and power. Sorry. God is a human conception of supranatural being and power, meaning and value. And I have another definition on its way in by the look of it from Katie. The reason I ask this question is that one of the things I'll argue shortly is that the supernatural worldview is alien to Scripture. There is no such thing as supernaturalism in the New Testament or the Old Testament. Nothing supernatural happens in the Bible at all. That sounds more controversial than it actually is. That's not to say that the things in the Bible didn't all happen. It's just that the way that we describe it is often mistaken, and it's good to avoid using words like supernatural. Again, I'll come on and explain that later on. Okay, let's press on with the second part of the presentation. One of the things I'd like to talk about a little bit is the gods who do exist today. In particular, I'd like to talk about Mars and Venus, but before I jump into the second part of the presentation, could I ask Enton, please, to bring up the second question? Can you define in one sentence what worship actually is without describing it as a religious concept? Can you describe what worship actually is without describing it as a religious concept? One of the things that I think it's worth looking at in our world today, one of the questions that needs to be asked and is being asked actually by social anthropologists and geographers, again here at Cambridge and presumably elsewhere, is why is it that we know that our planet at present is on our highway to self-destruct, that we're facing ecological terror, and yet still fracking, for instance, looking in any corner for this substance that we should be weaning ourselves off? Why is it that we're doing nothing about the ecological terror that awaits us and only seem to be making things worse? Why is it equally that we are heading for economic catastrophe, and after the great crash of 2008, why is it that we're recommending more of the same when so many rational, intelligent people know that we cannot continue like this? Why do our international leaders seem so helpless to stop? Why do we seem to be stuck on this treadmill where someone else is controlling the speed? Why is it that we seem powerless and helpless to stop the forces that are dehumanizing people and forcing our planet into potential oblivion? My argument is that it's because we have not sufficiently reckoned with what a god is. And one of the ways that I would describe a god, small g, as well as big G, actually, would be forces that shape human fate that are beyond the human ability to control. Forces that shape human fate but are beyond human ability to control. We can't stop the disasters that we're facing, even though we're clever enough to do it. And in theory, it should be easy to do it. So, one of the things that I will argue is that the gods who've been worshipped throughout history and gods that are still worshipped today are Mars and Venus. Mars, the ancient Roman god of war. Venus, traditionally the goddess of sex, although it's a little bit more than that. Please erase from your minds this book, what was it called? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Forget about that conception. Mars is to do with a celebration of violence and war in making the world a better place. Venus is to do with allure, and more specifically, economic allure. I'd like to take us back to ancient Rome, to something called the Imperial Cult. Let's start though in ancient Greece again. If you can imagine what it's like to live, say, in 8th century BC mainland Greece, where the place is being run by multiple different local warlords. Now, how would daily life feel when lived in the knowledge that the crops that you have sown might be reaped by future invaders? People who could invade your land at any moment. They can end your livelihood, they can take your land, they can kill your family, they can end your life. Everything that you possess is vulnerable. You're living in a state of radical daily insecurity. So any leader that can bring military security is bringing life itself. So try to imagine, if you can, how it is that you would prevent local warlords from stealing your land. One of the best things that you would do is to set up a shrine in his honor at your local town. And this is what happened in ancient Greece, that kings would be worshipped in the temples, not as gods specifically themselves, but as temple-sharing deities. And you're likely to be safer if you're worshipping the local warlord. Equally, if you are a king, what better way to maintain security and obedience among the land under your control than to have its inhabitants worshipping at your shrine? It's much easier to police a country when everyone is worshipping you. So this is the origin of something called the Imperial Cult. By the time we get to the New Testament, Augustus bursts onto the pages of history, and for the first time he had achieved feats that could only have been done by gods, so it was believed. He brought not just security, but sufficiently strong and lasting security to establish not only peace, but an era of peace in which justice can flourish. These are seen as the action of a god. And so Augustus began to be worshipped as a god, starting in the eastern provinces and gradually penetrating Rome itself. Worshipping the emperor was the fastest growing religion in the 1st century AD. It wasn't Christianity, it was the imperial cult. We spoke a little bit about Christendom earlier. Emperor worship continued on and off over the next few centuries. And with the conversion of Constantine and the Christianization of the empire, one historian called Howard Key simply says that under Constantine, Christianity had become the imperial cult by any other name. That any emperor after Augustus had to show that he was descended from both Mars and Venus. Throughout the first 3 centuries AD, there's a sacred geographical layout of every town where there would be statues of Mars and Venus, not in the temples, but in the marketplace. There would be statues of the emperors in the marketplace. The coinage that was used in daily trade worked like a live Twitter feed. You'd have these blasphemous inscriptions on the coins, Heavenly Venus, Mars the pacifier, the Caesars, our lords. If the very coins that you use to live on a daily basis worshipped both the divinity of the emperor, acknowledged the divinity of the emperor, and acknowledged the divinity of Mars and Venus. These are the two things, the two gods that you need to run an empire in any age, because Mars represents visible military supremacy. Venus represents the economic allure. And if you question the authority of either of those, you would find yourself in serious trouble. It's why the Christians were persecuted. And I can't help wondering whether the beast and the whore mentioned in the book of Revelation, these images, in the book of Revelation, John writes to smuggle his subversive political literature below the radars of Roman censorship. He writes about the beast and the whore, and I wonder whether those pictures are a deliberate parody of Mars and Venus. Because if you're not a beneficiary of the empire, then Mars and Venus can appear very much as enemies and insurmountable enemies rather than as allies. Now, if you read contemporary thinkers like, let's think, Noam Chomsky, for instance, I think he's the most widely cited academic of the 20th century. Noam Chomsky says that every empire needs two things to function. It needs to have this visible military supremacy, and it needs to have a strong economic ideology that everybody buys into. Now, we don't necessarily worship Mars and Venus anymore, but at least not consciously. But one of the things that I argue in the book is that actually, unwittingly, and with less self-consciousness and self-awareness than our atheistic ancestors, we do worship Mars and Venus in the modern age. I tread lightly with so many North Americans being part of this sort of seminar to talk about 9/11, the horrific atrocity of September the 11th, 2001. But think about the targets that the terrorists used. Just think about what they are for a moment. The principal target being the trade towers. What does that represent? It's the economic ideology of our age. It's not just an attack on the US, although of course that's what it was. It's an attack on the modern West, on the ideology, the economic ideology of the modern West. Equally, what was the other target, the other main target that was successfully hit, was the Pentagon. And as you may know, the US military spends as much on its military forces as the rest of the planet put together. You see the targets, the economic ideology, the military supremacy. Mars and Venus are crucial to the way that we run our modern day world. It's how the modern West runs, with a heavyweight dependence upon Mars and Venus. Now, lots of people will question this. Lots of people will question whether actually we are still celebrating violence, for instance. Are we still violent? Are we still people who appreciate and enjoy violence? Well, there's a book by somebody called Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he seriously argues that since the Enlightenment, as time goes by, humanity progresses and we become less and less violent. Now, it leaves me speechless, obviously, because I'm baffled at how you can seriously make that argument. He spends 700 pages making that argument, arguing that we are less violent than we used to be and violence is gradually being eradicated from our world. And that's because we are not like our morally retarded ancestors, because we're moving away from things like religious belief and religious texts, and we're opening our nations up to modern day economic systems. Now, of course, one of the things that Pinker doesn't do, despite 700 pages of book, is say what actually constitutes violence. So, for instance, in Madagascar, the IMF withdrew funding for a crucial mosquito eradication program, and the result was the death of between 10 and 15,000 people, at least 5,000 of them children. Now, those deaths, those children that died, do not feature in Pinker's analysis, because the agents of violence were mosquitoes rather than soldiers. So we don't have to count that as violence. The suffering caused by the economic ideologies that we tend to endorse is not something that's ever addressed. We just don't question or think about that. Stephen Pinker has been severely critiqued elsewhere, I think. But I mean, it could be questioned, I suppose. If you look at the difference between, let's think, the old Star Wars. There's a new Star Wars movie coming out. But think about the first three Star Wars movies from the 70s and 80s, and the second three from the, whatever it was, the noughties, the ones that are about 10 years old. In the original Star Wars movies, the cannon fodder were stormtroopers, but they were clearly human being stormtroopers. So, you know, we slaughtered these things en masse, albeit with an elegant weapon from a more civilized age and all that. It was perfectly okay to go slaughtering all these people because they were baddies. Now, of course, in the new Star Wars movies, a generation later, we have evolved from that. We're no longer so crudely violent. We don't celebrate that kind of violence anymore. And so what are the cannon fodder in the new movies? It's these robots with highly advanced motor movement, independent reasoning capacities, and yet voices that are based on crude technologies from 1980s planet Earth, just to show that the victims of violence are not human. And because they've been dehumanized, we can just slaughter them en masse, and so they get chopped down left, right, and center. You could look equally at the difference between the modern and the postmodern James Bond. Remember the old Bond movies with Sean Connery and Roger Moore and others, where it was just awful British imperialism, where you've got this terrible guy who will kill somebody and grace their corpse with a quip before he's made his joke, and then he goes and sips his martini. The whole violence just washes over him. Whereas the new James Bond is scarred by his history of violence. The new James Bond, played by Daniel Craig now, still drinks his martini, but he grasps it as a refuge from his wounded memory. And so the idea is, again, that we've developed a little bit, we've moved on, we're no longer so insensitive to violence. But what's hidden from this is that nevertheless, both movies continue to be cool movies precisely because they are violent. They both endorse the myth of redemptive violence, as it's sometimes called. That's violence. We could say the same about economics. We can talk about how Venus shapes our ideology. You only have to look at this sort of 1957 classic by Vance Packard called The Hidden Persuaders, where he presents the idea that in order to sell your product, you have to use your adverts to make people feel too stupid, too fat, too thin, too ugly, too outdated, too everything, so that they will have to buy your product in order to be a worthy human being. You make people feel less than human in order to sell your product. Now, of course, this is 60 years ago. Today, marketing works slightly differently because it's supposed that we have evolved and we're a bit more savvy. And so marketing is now called marketing. But it still works on the same basis. It still works on the basis that we have to be told again and again and again that we are socially and morally unworthy until we have bought our way out of social unworthiness by buying the product that's on offer. You see, this is like the medieval practice of priests selling forgiveness. Indulgences, they were called. It's precisely the same dynamic. We have to buy our way out of social unworthiness. These things reach into the very core of who we are. I'm conscious that I'm wittering for quite a while, but I refer you to a book by an author whose name I can't pronounce. It's called What About Me? And it's by I think he's a Belgian chap called Paul Verhaeghe, I think it's called. I'll type that in a few minutes, where he argues that contemporary economic ideology reaches into the very depths of our identity and shapes the way that we think and feel and believe and act. Again, Venus and Mars reach into the very core of who we are. The new atheists don't get anywhere near these questions, of course. They've been described by one author as the intellectual wing of the war on terror. Actually, there's a great little book which, yes, Reason, Faith and Revolution, which is by Terry Eagleton. It's a fantastic little book, the funniest, liveliest, most entertaining political reading of the new atheists, which again, like Noam Chomsky, describes them as worshippers of the gods of the state. Whilst claiming to be the atheists, these guys are actually the high priests of Mars and Venus, and unwittingly so, endorsing modern day dehumanizing patterns of economics, endorsing the god of war. Question mark over Richard Dawkins on that one, but that's a more complex debate. At this stage, all I want to argue is that Mars and Venus are running our world, railroading us into a future of ecological and economic catastrophe, and anyone who is genuinely atheist will show contempt for these gods, not by denying their existence, but by defying these gods, by remortalizing them, by making them angry. If you want to prove that Mars and Venus exist, then try standing against them and you will feel the full weight of their fury. Thank you that concludes this little section of the talk I wanted to give. I would like to point out thank you to Enton for managing to put the link up about that book by Paul, unpronounceable name. Thank you, Enton. May I invite Stan back onto the stage to field what questions we may have?
Well, thank you, Simon. I think what we're looking at then is also from an Anabaptist understanding, perhaps that as we think about those values, then are we atheists as the way that you described in terms of the gods of Mars and Venus? We have some comments in terms of responding to your question about worship. And we have Katie says, I suppose if I might describe God, and this is also responding to the comment, the question on God, I suppose that it is someone or something, whether professed or implied by life decisions or values, that is the focus of our deepest trust and mission. This is my theoretical comment, not my statement of faith, which is that God is the ultimate power of love and goodness in and beyond this world. Bill also clarified his comment on God. He said, I meant to say suprahuman sources of being and power. It seems from an anthropolitical point of view that the purpose of religion and worship is to control or influence this power. And then worship, responding to the question, Anton gave this definition, worship the glorifying and giving of ourselves to whatever it is that captures our allegiance, to which we ascribe ultimate value. And Katie then second Enton's attempt or definition. So those are some of the the comments and questions that we have. So, Simon, I invite you to respond to these statements of worship, and then also, what does this mean? And so, in what ways might Mars and Venus then have crafted the God of Scripture in their own image? And we've lost, Simon, we've lost your volume. Unmute.
I think I'm unmute, thank you. Some of these are superb, and I think when you describe worship in these ways, and then look at the gods of our age that we are worshipping, it's interesting. I think it's very telling. It gives you an insight into what contemporary culture really is and what's really happening in the world. I would like a little bit more time to read through and absorb the impact of some of these definitions. I should at least say thank you for them. I will respond to some of these, I think, and put them onto the website that is linked with the book, because I'm conscious that time is running very, very low indeed.
And
we'll
post the website in the chat box as well, and that is www.afterchristendom or atheismafterchristendom.com. So
great. So I was just going to ask if there are questions to which I'm responding. I'm sorry, I've got carried away with myself.
They were making comments. They were responding to your questions and responding to the definitions of both God and worship. And so that's where we're at. And so are there thoughts that you want to share to close out our time this afternoon?
I suppose so. I mean, for me, I think the beating heart of the Christian life is resurrection, and resurrection is a tricky thing. It's often viewed as a bizarre miracle. I don't believe resurrection is a miracle. I believe it's a perfectly natural part of the substructure of the universe as God has created it. When we're called to live resurrection life, it's a call in the first instance, it vindicates Jesus' way of being atheist. Now, of course, Jesus doesn't use that language, but much of what Jesus does makes him accidentally atheist. It brings upon him the wrath of these sort of conceptions, some of the conceptions of who the God of the Jews really is. Because there's no such thing as Judaism in the first century. As is often said, there are Judaisms. Jesus defies many of those. Equally, he defies the Roman Empire. He puts him to death. And now that suggests that Jesus' way of being human, that Jesus' invitation to a life of powerlessness, a life of simply questioning the authority of these gods, is not doomed to failure. It looks like these things can be doomed to failure, but first and foremost, the resurrection is not proof that God exists, or that there is life after death, or that God can do the impossible. Resurrection at ground level vindicates Jesus' way of being human. It's not a futile endeavor. Resurrection says that faithfulness to God, to this God at work in this Jesus, is the way that we make the world a better place. If Mars and Venus are railroading our world into a state of self-destruct, Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, the resurrected life to which he calls Christians, is where true spiritual, political, social hope for the future of the world really lies. And I think I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. This has been a wonderful presentation, and I want to bring Enton on. to share with us some closing items that for our housekeeping and to bring before we bring our webinar to a close. Anton?
Thanks, Dan. And Simon, sorry that we're running out of time. There's enough material, I know, to go a good bit longer yet. So I'll just try to go slowly so you have a little more time. But I put up 2 polls. So those of you that are participating on our webinar today, if you would just be able to click first on how helpful was the presentation, the content and the learning from Simon, and second, how well did you like this webinar format, the online meeting? And then for those of you seeking continuing education units from the Church of the Brethren, there are instructions, and I'll post that as a live link in the chat window as well, that you'll be able to follow to be able to get that. And again, CEUs for those that have attended the live presentation today. But I'll turn it right back, Simon, to you and Stan for a few more comments and questions as you go.
Simon, the description that you laid out, Mars and Venus, and that it having so much more meaning behind it than just military per se, or economic, that it's much wider. And then as you connected that to Scripture, it just brought to memory the stories of Jesus, like the healing of the healings or the interaction, like with the soldiers, the interaction at the temple, the healing of the demonic with the in the herd of pigs and everything. Those have so much more meaning and connection to that imagery now of Mars and Venus. What other things in Scripture might we be missing or overlooking with that analogy?
I suppose you could look at the opening chapter of Paul writing to the Romans. Paul describes himself as a slave of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his son, who was descended from David. That opening paragraph is full of politically subversive language. Savior was a title for the Roman emperor. Gospel is not a religious word at all. It meant the arrival of the emperor, and that's how it would first have been heard. Son of God is one of the emperor's titles. Apostle is, again, an imperial title. Paul is not just writing to some random church in a backwater. He's writing to Rome, to the church in Rome, where that opening paragraph is full of deliberately subversive, explosive pictures of what the empire is and what the emperor is. And Paul kicks off by grabbing those titles and giving them to Christ himself. And he spends the rest of the book unpacking what those things mean. In terms of the Gospels, right the way through, they're full of not deliberately anti-imperial claims, but as you mentioned, driving the traders out of the temple. Josephus notes that the temple was the only place that the Romans weren't allowed to go. So it had become essentially where the Jewish resistance movements kept their arms. It's where they kept their weapons. So when Jesus pitches in there and says, this is a house of prayer for the benefit for all nations, and you have turned it into a den of robbers, it's translated generally. The word for robbers is better translated bandits or terrorists even, where Jesus is saying, look, by offering a violent response to the Roman Empire, you're playing the same game. These guys are worshipping Mars, and so much of the preaching of Jesus is deliberately not trying to fight fire with fire. He endorses the faith of a centurion and says that there's no faith in Israel like it, as you mentioned. The list could go on right the way through the Gospels, that Jesus could see that in his own age, the authorities were railroading his fellow Jewish folk into a state of disaster which visited itself upon the region in the late 60s in the form of the Imperial war machine, which destroyed the temple.
Yeah.
Revelation is the most explicitly subversive text, of course.
But we've kind of whitewashed it, if I may use the term of Revelation. It's more about, as I had one person say to me, why does all this matter? After all, God is going to burn this all up anyhow, and there's going to be this new heaven. So what does that say to us about how we are in denial, perhaps, about our, if you want to call it, our reverence to Mars and Venus as well, that we may not even recognize that?
That's the genius of how gods work, I think, is that after Christendom, Mars and Venus are free to operate as they choose. They fly beneath the radars of our perception nowadays, even can shape the way that we understand Christianity and the way that we view God. The extent of their reach, I think, is difficult to overestimate. The way that they reach into the very roots of our identity. This is why in early Christianity, the process of learning what the Christian journey was took years. It was proper, serious, hardcore, social, relational, personal, spiritual, liturgical reformation of the human character. Not just a bit of teaching, but a radical reorientation of the affections and the mind and the will. That's what Christian discipleship is. And if it's done well, then it's not that you set out to be deliberately anti-imperial or subversive or anything like that. It's just that these are almost the accidental fruits of walking with this Jesus.
Yeah. Well, Simon, thank you so much for today's presentation. I know you have other commitments as well yet today, and so we want to honor that, but we just really appreciate you sharing with us. And for anyone, please grab a copy of Simon's book, Atheism After Christendom. It's part of the After Christendom series. You can also check it out at the Anabaptist Network and other places. And it's been a delight to have you with us and to meet you and to just tap into your wisdom and your knowledge during this session. It has definitely been an enjoyable experience for me, and I would love to continue this conversation, but maybe by Skype.
Me too. Me too. Well, thank you very much to everyone that's participated and everyone that's taken part in this. Thank you especially to Enton and to you, Stan. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of Enton Eller and myself and Simon Perry, we want to express our gratitude and thanks for all who have joined us today. We appreciate your participation and your support, and we wish you God's blessings. Good night.